2025 marked the beginning of a grim chapter for South African agriculture. An outbreak of foot and mouth disease emerged that would persist for months, fundamentally shaking the industry. Thousands of red meat and dairy enterprises were concerned about the outbreak. In KwaZulu-Natal, it had spread to some of South Africa's largest feedlots. Farmers were unable to sell their livestock at auctions, feedlots, and abattoirs, which made it difficult to pay for expenses and keep their businesses running. Breeders, slaughterhouses, retailers, and exporters, the clinical signs became a common sight across affected regions nationwide. As the outbreak intensified, it triggered sweeping export bans across South Africa's key markets, including China, Saudi Arabia, and the EU. South Africa's livestock industry is constantly being held back by disease outbreaks like foot and mouth, bird flu, and African swine fever. The real danger of these shutdowns isn't just the immediate loss of revenue, it's the damage to our national reputation. Global buyers are already shifting their orders to competitors like Australia, Brazil, and Botswana. Foot and mouth disease is endemic in South African wildlife population, particularly in the Kruger National Park from African buffaloes, and it can spread to livestock. The disease affects cloven-hoofed animals, including cattle, pigs, sheep, and buffaloes. And FMD is a transboundary disease, meaning it's highly contagious and can spread quickly across national borders, spreading to new regions regardless of geographical boundaries. It is caused by an RNA virus known as FMDV, which has 7 different serotypes worldwide. Unfortunately, a vaccine for one serotype does not provide immunity against the other. As foot and mouth disease spread across South Africa, farmers began noticing the symptoms in their livestock. By mid-2025, cases were being reported internationally, and the media started paying attention, while farmers braced for a growing crisis. Local animal health experts and extension officers saw a surge of inquiries in their offices, raising alarm that action was needed. Institutions, from researchers to government bodies, were alerted about the outbreak. By late 2025, coverage had intensified, prompting further measures, but the question remained, was it enough? Now, we're about to embark on one of the largest FMV crises South Africa has ever faced. How did it happen? Make sure to like and subscribe to Tescor and grab your popcorn. This is a story you don't want to miss. European breeds, also known as Bos Taurus, began making their way into South Africa in the late 1800s. These include dairy breeds like Friesland and Jersey, beef breeds such as Simantala and Charolais. Bos Taurus breeds are mostly less resilient to FMD compared to indigenous African breeds such as Nguni, Bonsmara, and Tuli. Across the country, many dairy farms are going out of business. South Africa is sadly losing a couple of dairy farms each day from a disease that could have been prevented. Most of the farmers lost their businesses because of financial and animal health pressures. It's not just dairy, it's also beef. Some stewed breeders have reportedly lost generations worth of genetics, and many more are in threat. This should be taken seriously. A few years earlier, South Africa had already dealt with an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, but nothing to this scale. What we are witnessing now stands as one of the largest FMD outbreaks in the country's history. Foot and mouth disease is not only dangerous, it is incredibly easy to spread. It moves from farm to farm, not only through animals, but through everyday human activity. Vehicles, tools, equipment, and even clothing become carriers. What seems ordinary becomes a risk. As the disease gained momentum, it forced far more serious intervention across the industry. Control zones were introduced, where animal movement was tightly restricted, monitored, and managed in an attempt to contain the spread.
But this idea of controlling disease through geography is not entirely new. In South Africa, the use of control zones has been developing for decades, evolving from basic border measures into highly regulated systems. It was shaped by two key realizations. The first was the buffalo connection. As early as the 1930s, researchers identified African buffalo as natural carriers of the virus. This discovery led to the construction of game-proof fencing around areas like the Kruger National Park, designed to separate infected wildlife from domestic livestock. The second was driven by trade. For South Africa to access international markets, it had to demonstrate that large parts of the country were free from disease. Zoning became the solution, allowing authorities to contain risk within specific regions while keeping the rest of the country open for export. That realization pushed the government to formalize a structured system of control zones, dividing the country into infected zones, protection zones, free zones, and disease management areas, commonly known as DMAs. Infected zones, often referred to as red zones, represent the highest risk areas. These are largely concentrated around the Kruger National Park and surrounding regions, where foot and mouth disease is endemic in wildlife population. A major challenge in these areas is the weakness of disease control fencing. Along the borders of conservation areas, like in parts of KwaZulu-Natal, fencing is often porous or damaged. This creates direct contact points between livestock and wildlife. African buffalo, which acts as natural reservoirs of the virus, can easily interact with cattle, placing communal farmers at great risk. The scientific and historical roots of this crisis stretch back nearly a century. In April 1931, a major foot and mouth disease outbreak was recorded in what was then southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in the Nyaneti district. Research from the University of Sussex highlights the scale of this disaster, noting that massive ranching operations were forced into drastic measures. As Ian Schoons and William Vollmer noted, one ranch alone reduced its herd of cattle to almost nothing. At the time, however, the true role of buffalo in spreading the disease was not fully understood. Early outbreaks raised suspicions, but the science had not yet caught up. Protection zones were established, based on assumption rather than certainty, part of a broader working theory built on systems. Over time, as research advanced, the epidemiology became clearer. It was eventually confirmed that African buffalo are indeed long-term carriers of the virus. This led to the refinement of protection zones, often called yellow zones. These areas form a critical buffer between infected red zones and disease-free regions. They are tightly monitored with strict controls of animal movement, typically extending 10 to 20 kilometers from infected areas. As the outbreak continued to disrupt the red meat industry, the focus shifted towards maintaining and expanding free zones, areas officially recognized as free from the disease. The goal is to achieve and maintain FMD-free status with vaccination, supported by strict biosecurity at entry points and gradual rollout of digital livestock traceability systems. Historically, most of South Africa fell into this category, but that status is now increasingly under threat. The numbers told a troubling story. During the second half of 2025, FMD cases surged sharply, pushing the annual total beyond 24,000, the highest ever recorded in South African history. To put that into perspective, the 2022 outbreak saw around 7,800 cases, more than 3 times lower. This was no longer a contained outbreak. It was a system under strain. The impact on the agricultural sector was severe. Farming businesses were collapsing under pressure. Vaccines were not being produced at scale required to match the spread. Reported cases continued to climb, and for many in the industry, it appeared that government's response lacked coordination and urgency. Eventually, the state turned to one measure it knew best: declaring a national disaster. The state officially classified the outbreak as a national disaster, following the failure to effectively contain the disease through control zones and enforcement measures. By this stage, the spread had already gained momentum, moving faster than the system is designed to stop. Despite the frustration, the industry welcomed the declaration, acknowledging that the outbreak posed a serious threat, not only to immediate production, but the long-term sustainability of South Africa's agricultural sector and its ability to feed itself. Since early 2025, the surge in infections accelerated rapidly, with foot and mouth disease spreading across 7 of South Africa's 9 provinces. The pressure on the agricultural sector intensified as losses continued to mount, placing farmers under strain from every direction. By February 2026, the scale of the economic impact was becoming undeniable. According to Reuters quote, South Africa's beef exports fell 26% in 2025, despite growing global demand. This decline was driven in part by export bans, as key markets, particularly in Asia, restricted imports of South African red meat due to the ongoing outbreak. What emerges is a clear picture: a disease that began as a biological threat quickly evolved into a major economic crisis, reshaping trade flows, weakening export capacity, and placing the future of South African red meat industry under serious pressure. The fight against foot and mouth disease was no longer just a crisis. It had become a war. To fully understand the scale of this situation, we need to map the vulnerability context facing the agricultural sector. First, there are the shocks. These include the rapid spread of the disease itself, restrictions on the movement of animals, and the sudden disruption of markets through export bans. Each shock compounds the next, creating a ripple effect across the entire value chain. Then comes seasonality. At certain times of the year, demand for feed increases significantly, especially during winter. This drives up production costs at the very moment farmers are least able to generate income. With movement restrictions in place, farmers are unable to sell livestock to offset these costs. As a result, margins become thinner, pushing many into debt, and in some cases, bankruptcy. This pressure is amplified by the structure of the system, the structure of the industry, where approximately 75% of cattle in South Africa are finished in feedlots. Beyond that, there are longer-term trends. Input costs are rising across the board. Fertilizer prices are increasing, partly due to global instability, including conflict in the Middle East, which in turn raises fuel costs. These inputs are essential for producing feed and operating machinery. At the same time, beef prices have been driven upward by supply shocks, adding further pressure on both producers and consumers. Taken together, these shocks, seasonal pressures, and long-term trends help unpack the mounting strain on farmers, the industry, and the broader economy. In response, the Minister of Agriculture outlined a bold objective to vaccinate the entire South African herd, estimated at around 12 million animals. However, this approach centralizes vaccine control within the state. It limits the ability of private producers to manufacture and distribute vaccines, and in practice, it also restricts farmers from administering vaccines without permits. And this has created significant tension. What was intended as a control measure has now become a point of conflict, so much so that it has escalated into legal battles. At its core, it reflects growing frustration between government and organized agriculture. The Department of Agriculture finds itself in a difficult position, acting both as a regulator and an operator at the same time. So why are farmers taking the government to court? When you look deeper, the issue comes down to three key factors: legislation, operating conditions, and strategy. First, regulation and access. Vaccine access is tightly controlled and centralized during a crisis. This makes it difficult for farmers to obtain vaccine, despite the presence of multiple companies with the capacity to produce and distribute them at scale. Second, the operating condition. Trade policy, shrinking margins, and the urgency of the outbreak all create an environment where decisions are being made under pressure, often without enough flexibility for farmers on the ground. Thirdly is the strategy, and specifically state capacity. They are concerned around shortages, delays, and inconsistencies in execution. The capacity to vaccinate at scale remains a critical challenge for government. Under mounting pressure from the red meat industry, on 6 February 2026, the Agricultural Research Council released South Africa's first locally produced foot and mouth disease vaccine in more than 21 years. From the government's perspective, it was presented as a major milestone. However, within the industry, reactions were far more critical. Many farmers and experts argued that the development was long overdue, pointing to earlier opportunities that could have helped slow or even contain the escalating outbreak. Prominent veterinarian Dr. Odendaal was particularly outspoken, stating that this was not a sudden breakthrough. He pointed out the vaccine had already been researched more than 15 years ago and had, in fact, been fully registered in 2022. Looking further back, earlier phases of this work had already shown promise. During previous outbreaks, when the disease was still far less widespread, the government invested significant taxpayer funds and international expertise into vaccine development. By around 2010, research progress had advanced to a point where a viable vaccine development was already possible. By 2022, the vaccine had formally been registered, and in 2023, it was once again publicly acknowledged and celebrated as a ready solution that had been sitting within the system. Yet despite this progress, production and rollout at scale never materialized in time. As the outbreak intensified, the opportunity window narrowed. Critical research had been left to sit idle, acknowledged but not acted upon, until the crisis had already escalated. In hindsight, voices like Dr. Odendaal's have been loud. Effective vaccines existed, but were not deployed at scale when they could have been and could have made a difference in the crisis. Instead, the outbreak continued to grow, eventually becoming one of the largest. On the 21st of February 2026, South Africa received its first batch of 1 million high-potency foot and mouth disease vaccines, supplied by Biogenesis Bago. From the state side, this was presented as a critical step forward in the nationwide vaccination campaign, an attempt to contain the outbreak and begin restoring confidence in global trade. The doses were distributed across affected areas in an effort to curb the spread. But on the ground, the question remained, was it enough? Smallholder farmers, game farmers in particular, felt increasingly excluded from vaccination programs, while still carrying the burden of strict quarantine costs under ongoing movement restrictions. For many, the response still felt uneven and reactive rather than comprehensive. As the situation developed, additional vaccine supplies entered the country. These included 1.5 million doses from the Turkish manufacturer Dolvet and a further 700,000 doses from the Botswana Vaccine Institute. The BVI, it had already supplied around 2 million doses since the start of the outbreak, reinforcing its position as a consistent regional supplier whenever South Africa has faced vaccination shortages. Before this wave of imports, South Africa had only produced around 30,000 local doses. In the current outbreak, the last time the country had produced FMD vaccines at meaningful scale was in 2006. Since then, state capacity and related entities had steadily fallen behind, particularly in managing vaccination within controlled and high-risk zones. Scientifically, South Africa is dealing mainly with 3 foot and mouth disease serotypes: Z1, Z2, and Z3. These Southern African territory strains require precise vaccine matching. The imported vaccines from Argentina, Turkey, and Botswana were selected specifically to match the circulating field strains. On 23 January 2026, Minister of Agriculture announced that local field samples had been dispatched to the Pirbright Institute in the United Kingdom. This marked the first submission since 2011. The Pirbright Institute, as the world reference laboratory for foot and mouth disease plays a critical role in confirming circulating strains and validating vaccine matching at international standards. By March 2026, results confirmed what local scientists had already been indicating through field work at institutions like the RRC and other veterinary labs. The Set1, Set2, and Set3 strains circulating in South Africa were a scientific match to the vaccines being deployed. Still, while the science aligned and imports increased, the reality on the ground remained more complex. Vaccines were arriving, but distribution gaps, exclusion concerns, and capacity constraint continued to shape how effective the response actually was. In January 2026, a new private sector development added another layer to the unfolding foot and mouth disease response. Design Biologics, a specialized South African vaccine company. It announced that it had been appointed as the exclusive agent for the Argentine manufacturer Biogenesis Baker. Following this appointment, the company began preparations to secure around 6 million emergency doses of the Biogen vaccines, with planned delivery between February and April. The intention was clear: to make large volumes of vaccines available directly to farmers and feedlot operators at competitive and accessible pricing through private distribution channels. However, just weeks later, tensions emerged after meetings between Pretoria and the Argentine manufacturer Biogenesis Baker. The agreement was abruptly terminated. Correspondence suggested that the National Department of Agriculture preferred to engage directly with the manufacturer rather than operate through a private intermediary. This immediately sparked concern within parts of the country and the industry, with critics arguing that the state was effectively creating a bottleneck by sidelining private sector logistics capacity that could have accelerated distribution. In response, Pretoria maintained that it did not block the importation of vaccines by Design Biologics, noting that the company remained a recognized South African agent for the Biogenesis Baker product. Officials also pointed other examples such as agents of the Dunevax involved in securing permits for vaccines, like the Turkish Dolvet supply, arguing that private participation was still possible. However, despite these assurances, procurement remained largely centralized under state control. By this stage, momentum in the response was undeniable. The country had seen its first vaccine production in over 2 decades, and its first formal field strain submission to the Pirbright Institute since 2011. These were significant milestones, but on the ground, farmers were asking a different question. Not whether the system or the systems were moving, but rather were they moving fast enough and whether were they moving freely enough. Many livestock producers continued to push for the ability to administer vaccines through private veterinarians, especially when products were already licensed and available internationally. At the same time, the human cost of the outbreak was becoming increasingly visible. Some farmers lost everything. Breeders watched decades of genetic selection disappear as entire herds were culled or wiped out. Valuable bloodlines were lost, kraals emptied, and what once represented generational breeding programs were reduced to carcass destined for the meat supply chain. For dairy producers, the impact was equally severe. Some animals suffered prolonged illness and distress. And in the worst cases, farmers and farms were left with nothing but the aftermath. Together, these pressures intensified what had already become a deeper structured conflict, turning a disease outbreak into a broader struggle over control, capacity, and the future model of agriculture in South Africa. And for the meat producers in particular, this was not just policy debate, it was survival. The majority of South Africa's beef production system is built around feedlots, which sit at the center of the value chain. Most cattle entering these systems come from weaner-calf operations, the dominant form of beef production in the country. In this model, calves are raised to a weaning stage and then sold into feedlots, where they are efficiently finished for slaughter. From there, the animals move downstream into abattoirs, meat processors, and ultimately the consumer market. Feedlots therefore function as a critical link between primary producers and the final market. In fact, it is estimated that feedlots are responsible for finishing around 75% of all beef produced nationally. At any given time, commercial feedlots in South Africa can accommodate roughly 650 head of cattle, with the capacity to finish to close 1.7 million cattle for slaughter annually. However, these figures are not fixed. They fluctuate constantly due to disease outbreaks, movement restrictions, cattle availability, and changing input costs. Additional pressures, such as quarantine requirements, further erode profitability, especially when animals are held longer without being moved through the system. This structure is important when considering disease control. In feedlot systems, vaccination is relatively straightforward because animals are already concentrated and handled. But the challenge is very different in weaner calf and breeding operation systems. Here, vaccination is not about preparing animals for slaughter. It is about keeping breeding stock alive, healthy, and productive. Make sure to like and subscribe to Tescor. And next time, make sure you grab your popcorn before clicking onto our video.